This is a real honor for the Canyon Center to be hosting this climate seminar. And the funniest thing is how things work. So the two presenters, Dr. McClintock and Steve Apfelbaum, have never met. And they just met a few minutes ago in the back of the building. Luckily, it was on camera with Alabama Public Television. And if you notice, there are some cameras in the back of the room. This is an APT project. I'm honored to be a commissioner of Alabama Public Television, and it's great to have these folks up here. I have a number of folks from Birmingham with us producing and participating as well, so that's terrific. And so you'll be able to see bits and pieces of what we're doing today later on, and watch our Canyon Center Facebook page, and you'll get a chance to find these clips as they become available. But funny thing, Steve Apfelbaum is doing research up here on the mountain on the Owen property and the Gentry property, and had been passing by for 3 years, and then somehow or another he and I met at the Hampton Inn down in Jacksonville, and we sat in some really old crooked chairs that did stimulate a wonderful conversation, and felt like I'd known him all my life, and suggested that he come back to give a talk. Well, I had no idea that Jim McClintock was going to where I used to work, the Anniston Museum of Natural History. He gave a presentation there, had a wonderful audience from the Anniston Museum, and I had so many friends saying, "You haven't met Jim?" And I hadn't met Jim. So it was just so great to meet Jim McClintock, his wife Fern, and we have some world-class scientists here to talk about an issue that is not talked about enough, except when you look at they'll turn on television. It appears as though sometimes it's the only thing being discussed. But what's not being discussed so much is the relationship between agriculture and climate, soil and climate. And as you know, last month was determined to have been the hottest ever, and the World Bank has been talking about the biggest problem associated with climate may not be the heat, it's the ability of planet Earth to produce food. And I don't know about you, but I love to eat. And so these are some of the issues that will be discussed this evening. And with no further ado, I'd really like to introduce Tim Lindblom. He's the colleague at Jacksonville State University, and he is the dean of the School of Science. And Tim, glad to have you here. Round of applause, please.
Thank you, Pete. I'm just thrilled that we could get this many people in the room to have this conversation, and this is going to be an exciting day for us, and I want to thank you very much for showing up. I'm also really humbled to introduce two, as Pete said, world-renowned scientists today. This is going to be a fascinating afternoon, but I'd also like to say that both of these guys are in the running for the most interesting man in the world, and when you get to talking to them and hear their stories, they've been a lot of places and done a lot of really fun things. They're both also accomplished authors, and so I'll tell you a little bit about their books before each speaker. And what we're going to do, we're going to have Steve speak first, and then we're going to take just a short, tiny little break and get Jim right up here and get him talking. And then we're going to bring them both up here together and field questions at the same time so they can kind of talk back and forth about some of the questions that you might have. So I think that's going to be a fun format. So let me introduce Steve. So Steve Apfelbaum is a native of Wisconsin. He did his BS and his master's degree at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, a really fun town. And one of the things I found out about Steve today that I thought was really impressive, and my students thought was really impressive when he came to speak to school today, was that as a student, he started a company. Yeah, you do this. That's perfect. He started a company that is thriving today, and a lot of his work comes at the hand of this company, and he'll tell us a little bit about that. But he spent his career doing ecological restoration. You're going to hear a little bit about agricultural restoration today, but he's also worked in stormwater management and also remediation and restoration of brownfield sites. And just a whole host of different ecological restoration type activities. He has been awarded several things for this work, and I think one of the ones that I like the most is that he's the recipient of the John T. Curtis Award for Career Excellence in Ecological Restoration, which he won in 2010. And his work has also been recognized when he was appointed to the U.S. Forest Service Scientific Roundtable for Biological Discovery. Biological biodiversity, thank you. which is obviously another hot topic, all interrelated to the things that we've done. He's also an accomplished author, and in addition to the many scientific articles that we chatted about that we don't get as many people to. Yeah, that's perfect. He's got a lot of great books here, and I want to point them out to you. And they're also going to be available for you to purchase, and maybe we can get signed after at the reception. So here's a book, Nature's Second Chance. This is your first book, is that right? First nonfiction book. It's all about restoring the ecology on a particular farm. And this, he says, is this your favorite book to have written?
Yes.
S is for Soils.
S is for Soils, a children's book, and it was the most challenging to try to translate top soil scientist language and dialogue after 10 years of working on a National Science Foundation and with a large team of scientists into a book that people can understand. Little people, my size and smaller.
So this is for the rest of us, right? And if you have a piece of property that you're trying to restore, he's actually put a book series. This is the first of the 3 book series on how to restore your property from an ecological perspective.
Yep.
Well, please welcome Steve Apfelbaum.
I suppose I have to stand in the spotlight literally here. Well, wonderful being here. I discovered the Canyon Center after doing bird surveys right down the road at 4 o'clock in the morning and stumbling out into the Owen and Gentry properties and learning about the birds. And I'll give you some sense of what I learned, and needed a couple of hours of interlude before doing vegetation analysis. And I wound up here and asked, wow, this is such a wonderful place. How did this center come about? And met Pete later that day in Jacksonville. And thank you for that process of learning about this place and the wonderful history, the wonderful community of Fort Payne and also Jacksonville and Piedmont and the other places that we're working. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a really, really important subject to all of us. And to me personally as a scientist, to work on something that's applied, that's not simply a research project, I feel like the soils on the planet are so fundamental to everything that we count on. You know, whether it be the water cycle, the food that we grow and eat. Pete eats at least 3 times a day, I'm sure of it, and I like to do that as well. The biodiversity on the planet, the economy of our neighborhood, of our community, of our state, of our nation. It really, everything all revolves around the health of the soil. If the soil is depleted, like in places like Sudan and parts of Africa now, and in places in the United States where it's salinized, it's full of salt, the economy collapses, the communities collapse, the biodiversity hitchhikes out of there, and that's not a direction that any of us care to see the nation go in or our community. Doesn't matter what our political persuasions are, blue state, red state, none of that makes any difference. If we focus on the health of soil, we've got the right thing to focus on, in my opinion. So I've had the honor and pleasure of working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of farmers and ranchers and asking really dumb questions of them. You know, how they use their equipment, you know, why is the crop not growing in field X the way it is in field Y? What do they need to do a better job? How are they learning? Are they still learning? How did they learn? Who are they learning from? And what we learned with great humility is that the farmers and ranchers learn from each other. You know, the scientists kind of come in and poke at them on the side and may give them a socioeconomic study, may give them a crop report, but most of the real learning is peer-to-peer. Literally, sometimes meeting at the shared fence line and talking about why something's working or not working in their field. So we've been part of a research team that's organized through Arizona State University and has 18 research institutions working on it on the U.S. side, and in Canada, part of the exact same study through the University of Alberta, Edmonton, that's bringing all the ologists together, the birdologists, ornithologists, the botanists, the genomicists, the people that study the genetics of soil microbes and fungi, the socioeconomists, the livestock people that measure, I hope it's legal to use this term, but measure flatulence, that's the term I'll use, measure burps of the cattle and sheep and so forth, and many other scientists, grazing experts and crop experts. And we've all been working together across normal boundaries that occur within science and academia. And that requires a great deal of humility that the egos, can't work if we're all trying to learn, all trying to figure out what's happening on the land. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, it's with great honor and pleasure, and I'm representing a large group of researchers, a large group of farmers and ranchers that are intimately part of the program that we're engaged in. It's about regrowing healthy soils as one investment we could make nationally, locally, regionally, in Fort Payne, and incentivize that and support that in a myriad ways, and that will solve a lot of problems that we'll talk about. If I can advance this, I'll talk about it. There we go. So the research team started with a working hypothesis that if the land is carbon rich, and when I use the word carbon, I'm talking about essentially organic matter. If you're gardeners, you know what that means. If the land is carbon rich, we find the soil is healthy, and it's usually beneficial for the ecosystem and for the well-being and welfare of the livestock, the wildlife, the water cycle, and importantly, our family and our food systems. When any part of this chain is broken, usually the livestock, the wildlife on the far right end of it are actually impacted, and sometimes deleteriously, and we'll talk about that. So we were working with an oil company by the name of Shell Oil Company, and with the scientists at Shell, and they said we emit large quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we admit it, we know it's true, and all of our users of our gasoline products, United Airlines that uses aviation fuel, everybody's emitting carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. And how can we recognize that and come forth transparently and say it? But what can we do about it? Let's not argue about whether we are or aren't. We know we are, is what they said. And they wanted to figure out and be part of a solution. Their business model depends on a solution being part of their future. So the first thing we did is we said, well, let's look at the science. What's happening on the planet? And the graphics try to illustrate. We learned from the team that about nine very large quantities of carbon dioxide called gigatons, 9 gigatons, are being produced every year by us and being released into the atmosphere. About half of that, a little less than half, stays in the atmosphere for some period of time, and the other half is distributed in the oceans and in us and our pet dogs. I saw that little poodle. It's made out of carbon, guys and gals, and other things. And in the plants and the apples growing on our apple trees and the lawns that we mow, the soil beneath us, large percentage of it is carbon. So what we said is, wow, there's a lot of agricultural land on the planet and a lot of pastures, a lot of cropland and pastures on the planet. We said, according to USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the level of carbon in most of the nation's soils is depleted from its historic level by about 70 to 90%. So we said, what if we could work with farmers and ranchers and households that have gardens and landscapes and regrow soil organic matter? When I was a kid, I was told it took 1,000 years to grow an inch of topsoil. That's not true. We've got projects growing 5 inches of topsoil within a decade, 10 inches of topsoil within a decade. So we're learning that some of the myths that maybe they tried keeping it simple for us when we were young, so we'd respect soil. Some of those myths are not accurate. But what we decided to test was, there's 5 billion hectares. That's, 15 or so, 12 to 15 billion acres of cropland and pasture on the planet. And they're all depleted according to the records from the UN and USDA in this country. We said, what if we could increase the soil carbon levels in those depleted acres, or some large percentage of those depleted acres, by just 1% per year? And what it turns out is that, I'll just keep it simple. Let's just say that 5 billion hectares is, I'll just keep it simple. Let's just say we're trying to increase the 5 billion hectares by 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. If you multiply 1 ton of carbon times 5 billion hectares, that's 5 gigatons of carbon. So theoretically, which is impossible, but if all those croplands and pastures increase the carbon in the soil by 1 ton a year, that would equal more than the excessive CO2 and other greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere every year. So the engineers at Shell that weren't ever thinking about nature as part of the solution to some of the problems they were experiencing, the big light bulb went on. And that started a process that I'm going to tell you about here right now. So the goal that we all had was to try to evaluate whether we could put that back into the soil and regrow organic matter and all of the subsequent co-benefits: healthy food, healthy water, healthy people, healthy cattle, healthy wildlife. So my first introduction to whether this was even possible was by a professor, Dr. Richard Teague at Texas A&M University in Vernon, Texas. He showed me this ranch in northern Mexico, and he said when he first started working there, the ranch looked like what you see on the left. It looked like no plants, bare soil, surface of the soil completely bare. And I asked, well, how did you make the same piece of property look like the image on the right? And he said all it took was 5 years, and all we did, all the rancher did, is added more cattle to break up the crust in the soil, and that allowed water to go into the soil, and there were viable seeds and spores and turions and bulbs and roots in the soil, and they came back. So they added no plants, no seeds, no fertilizer, no herbicides, and they put 5 times the number of cattle that would normally be prescribed on this piece of land to go from what you see on the left to what you see on the right in approximately 5 to 7 years, is my understanding. The image on the left, all the water ran off. It did not soak in. Carbon dioxide was being outgassed because the soil was heating and the organic matter was being cooked, decomposed. If this was the condition of the watershed here at the Little River Canyon, and in the watershed of the Little River would not be the recreational asset or the biodiversity asset or the place of beauty that you all aspire to and this community appreciates. Water carries sediment, carries nutrients, rushes quickly. If it's not impeded by vegetation and life, that will absorb the energy in that water, and it'll blow out bridges and blow out roads and flood downstream neighborhoods. As soon as the plant materials take over, they develop root systems, they start bringing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's their job. By doing photosynthesis, they take a molecule of carbon dioxide and a molecule of water and a little zap of sunlight, and they do this miracle called photosynthesis. And we have never been able to replicate anything like that at the scale that plants do on the globe. It's a remarkable process. And plants build up the organic matter. They carry nutrients below in the deeper ground. They bring up cations, positively charged materials. And there's all sorts of life, birds, wildlife, and obviously grazing livestock that require that vegetation. So I saw this and I thought, holy gosh, this is a real opportunity. This can be done at large scales, and it needs to be done at large scales. The costs are minimal, except adding the additional cattle and the fencing. And the fencing that these folks were using was temporary hot wires. So it was very low-cost fencing, and they were moving, in this case, the cattle around with horseback, eventually ATVs, and it was, one person doing the job instead of a whole team of people. Very interesting process. So what we're doing now as a part of this Arizona State University grazing study is measuring soil, carbon, water, vegetation, microbes, socioeconomics, greenhouse gases, rancher and livestock well-being in what we're calling adaptive multi-paddock grazed pastures, where the pastures are broken up into little tiny paddocks, and the animals are moved through those pretty quickly, and they don't come back to those paddocks until the vegetation is recovered. So an adequate recovery period, and we're contrasting that with continuous grazing, where the rancher or the farmer might have 3 paddocks, and the cattle are led into one paddock at the beginning of the summer, the growing season, and maybe a month later they let them into the next one, and a month later maybe into the next one. What happens with that continuous grazing is every single day the cattle go out to the best plants. They keep on eating down the best plants, and when you eat down the top of the plant, the root system concurrently collapses down. If there isn't the above ground plant growth for the root system to support, the root system degenerates. And the whole cycle of building soil and the nutrients, the water cycle, starts to collapse as that process occurs. So what we've got here in the neighborhood is Teddy Gentry and Randy Owens. Some of their grazed land are included in the study, and a wonderful group of farmers, ranchers. I don't know what you call them here in Alabama, so I'll use both terms. The Lyon family right on the south end of Piedmont has been using this adaptive multi-paddock grazing, while a neighbor right across the fence is using continuous grazing. And we're studying those pairs. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing, I'll call it AMP grazing, is the way large herds of bison and these caribou, I was in a herd of about 25,000 caribou in Alaska 2 weeks ago, and this is a shot, they almost stepped on me. I was hiding, trying to get the best photograph, and of course I should have let them know that I was there. But these animals move across a large landscape, and they move quickly, and they might not come back for a year, and that's the recovery process in the Arctic. What I've learned from Dr. Teague is that overgrazing has nothing to do with the number of animals. It has to do with how long the plants are exposed to the animals, and also with the recovery period that's allowed and appropriate. That he has this wonderful saying that one cow can kill 10 acres of plants in a year, and 10,000 cows won't kill 50 acres of plants if you graze them correctly. Something like that. It's his saying. I'm allowed to abuse it. So in the neighborhood here, just to give you some sense, so the first thing I wanted to show you, as a little scientist, I have to show you some data. This is infiltration rates. This is a measure of how much water can be put into the ground in soils in these different grazing situations. So what we use is it looks like a pressure cooker from your kitchen, and it plugs into the ground, and then we have a water tank associated with it, and the water fully saturates the soil down to a meter, a couple of yards deep, 6-7 feet deep. And then we put water at a constant depth in that pressure cooker, and it measures how much additional water can go into the land. So all the measurements are started at the same 100% saturation level. And what we've measured, for example, in Jacksonville, is on the AMP grazed farm, about 2.5 inches of water an hour, and on the adjacent conventionally, continuously grazed, about half an inch per hour can go into the soil. We've also measured some of the local nature preserves. This is the Coosa Prairie, near just a little west of Rome, Georgia. To understand, this farm where they're grazing with the AMP grazing actually has significantly higher infiltration than the native prairie does, which is kind of interesting. In this neighborhood, Somebody by the name of Teddy Gentry is putting about 3.25 inches of water per hour into the ground, and a neighbor is doing about 50% less. So one of the neighbors is infiltrating water, which is feeding the springs and the seeps that maintain the water quality in the little river, and the other neighbor, it may not be doing quite as good of a job as the neighbor that's using the amp grazing. The other thing, it's really critical. An inch of water an hour might not seem like a lot, but when you multiply an inch an hour times the watershed scale, it's billions of gallons of water. So it really does matter. A little tiny improvement like that might not seem like much, but it really, really, really matters. So which side, I put the labels on there. This is a trick question. Which side do you think was using amp grazing for about 10 years and the other one using continuous grazing? And let me tell you the story. It's two brothers, not cousins, brothers. One side, the guy said, you know what, I have a full-time job. I just want to let the cattle out in the morning and they can go do their business. The other guy said, and did this for 10 years, I'm going to try this new technique. So this is for 10 years, for 10 years, the guy on the right actually built up from about 100 tons of carbon per acre, built up to 500 tons of carbon per acre. And you could physically see, hopefully you can see the difference in color than the person on the left. But even more importantly, this is a heavy clay soil in this image. The guy on the right, the farmer rancher on the right, is infiltrating 11 inches an hour more water into the groundwater. So that's not only good for places like the Little River, but also for potable water supplies. Where our aquifers are declining. This is an incredible low-cost way to rebuild water supplies. We learned that where the amp grazing was occurring, there was a lot less bare soil and a lot less invasive non-native plants. We also learned where the amp grazing was in place, the ground was covered with plant litter, not McDonald's hamburger wrappers, but plant tissue. It's fully covered year-round by growing tissue and dead tissue that the cattle have trampled. We also learned that there's significantly more available biomass for the cattle, livestock, and wildlife to eat in the amp grazed, and that native plant diversity also was significantly higher. We're still waiting for the soil results from all the projects that we're working on in the southeast. This is an ATV with a hydraulic ram that pulls a 1 meter long, 2-inch diameter plastic encased core sample out, and then that goes into the lab for the analysis of soil carbon and other testing that we're doing. We'll have all the results back from the southeast starting in December. But let me give you a prelude. What we're learning is that there's a really big difference, that not all green plants are the same. Some of the plants, like a lot of the planted pasture plants, have very shallow root systems, and they primarily put carbon down. This is a meter depth, so about 3 feet. They primarily put carbon down to about 6 inches, and that's where a majority of the carbon is. The native plants also do that, but what they do is they also pound the carbon deeper. We're measuring very high levels of carbon, well below the topsoil, which is where most of the non-native plants accumulate carbon. So we know from around the country that work we and others have done that in the southeast tier we expect about 5 to 7 tons of carbon per acre accumulating on an annual basis. And that's very high. In the upper Midwest where I'm from, it's about 2 to 3 tons. And if you go out here to the arid West, it's usually less than a ton. So you're in an ideal location to really rebuild organic matter and build soil carbon quickly and effectively. What do these grazed pastures look like? This is an amp grazed pasture after a full year of grazing, and the rest period, the recovery period, is just getting over. This is a continuous graze pasture after a rest period. And I'll let you decide which you think is more beautiful. I don't want to judge that, but what you see here is a lot of dead tissue that's not collecting sunlight. You know, plants are solar collectors. They collect and translate sunlight energy into the sugars and starches and wood and everything, you know, food that we eat. And because a lot of the material here is dead, it's not as effective a solar collector as the green lush tissue you see here. So the changes in the ecosystem are substantial. We find more insects, more birds, more large wildlife and small mammals in places like this than we do in places like that. And cattle seem to like the place on the left better. And so do birds. And just to give you some sense, what we found in Jacksonville, does everybody know that bird? Yeah, an eastern meadowlark. Do you know how much their populations have declined in the country since the 1960s? Any idea? Yeah, between 70 and 90%. And most of the grassland birds have suffered that same fate. You know, a lot of grasslands have been converted to row crop agriculture, which these birds don't live in. This particular species nests in the hoof print of cattle and elk and bison. So meadowlarks kind of burrow in and actually nest in those hoof prints where the grasses have been suppressed or depressed. But what's so interesting, in these amp-grazed locations, these obligate rare grassland birds in your neighborhood are they're richer, and there's a lot more individuals in the population. So they recognize the differences between the amp and the continuous graze system. And same thing at Fort Payne. The dark green is the rare grassland birds, and the light green is the light green are transitional birds that live in shrubby areas, which are much more common in the area. So we're learning that the birds respond favorably to this amp grazing. I'm going to switch gears on you and take you to crop fields now, because not everybody's doing grazing. This is Washington State, between Spokane and Pullman, Washington. And what we did there was we worked with farmers on about 100,000 acres of farms and applied a standard method for measuring their carbon in their soil, not because we wanted to do a science project, but we wanted to reward farmers that were actually defensibly, demonstrably increasing soil carbon in their soil. So we wanted to create a new revenue stream for the farmers, and we're in the process of doing that now. What it involved was studying and sampling a 30 million acre area, all of eastern Washington, good bit of eastern Washington, and understanding where carbon occurs on the landscape. Is it at the top of a hill, the side slopes, the bottom of the steep slopes out there in the Palouse? And after we understood where it was found, we went out and actually sampled different farms. So the sampling points are these random points that you can see here. And we went out with that equipment that I told you about a minute ago and sampled. And what we found out was that, and we sampled farmers doing what's called low disturbance cropping, which is one pass no-till. They drive over the soil once, they plant their crop, and then they come back and they harvest the crop, so it's a two-pass. You want to think of it that way. The normal farming community out there is doing tillage, conservation tillage, and moldboard plowing, and the soil carbon, the organic matter levels are continuing to decline. And these inspired farmers, based on the measurements, are actually increasing the organic carbon on their land and the crop yields and the nutrition and the quality of the food that they're producing. In fact, the farmers that we're working with are producing the finest pastry flour in the country. It's being used for really high quality pastry and pizza, very high protein flour because of the way they're farming it. So what we're doing with them is rewarding them financially. The difference between the declining curve and the increasing curve based on the on-farm measurements, represents a revenue stream, and it's roughly equal to about $1 to $2 million in additional revenue for a farm over a decade. So the carbon improvements are being packaged and being sold, which is such an interesting opportunity for farmers to actually be growing not just wheat, but actually growing water supply, regrowing carbon, and so forth and so on. The place we're working on out there is a very large landscape. You know, Spokane is up here and Pullman is down here. That's hundreds of miles. The area in light green is an area that gets about 18 inches of moisture, of rainfall a year, and the area in yellow gets about 16 inches or less. So the different moisture zones are accruing different quantities of carbon. And the farmers, if they're achieving the benefits that we project, are getting paid accordingly. Now I wanted to just say something about how durable soil carbon is. You know, in the 60s and 1970s, we were all led to believe that old growth forests were, you know, really, really important to save, and they are. I'm not dismissing their value. But one of the reasons we were told they were so important was because the trees are really old. But let me tell you what old looks like. In your neighborhood right here, based on carbon dating of the soil carbon, down to just between 1/10 of a meter and 1 meter down, the average age of the soil carbon is 500 to 200,000 years of age, 2,000 years of age. It's been a long day. 500 years of age to 2,000 years of age. I don't know of any trees in the neighborhood that are 2,000 years of age. Near east of Albuquerque, you go down 0.2 of a meter, so 12 inches roughly. The average age of the carbon is 30,000 years of age. And if you go down between 0.2 of a meter and 0.5 a meter, it's 3 to 5 million years old. So we need to begin realizing that this stuff we step on every day, it's not only our heritage, our legacy, it is really important to honor something that's taken that long to become just the perfect wine. We want to keep it around, treat it wisely. So with Shell, we began looking at what would it take to achieve benefits, improving soil, improving water, improving climate, improving food quality at a very large scale, the scale of the planet. So we did modeling, and modeling is one way to test ideas. This is the current, so this scale tells you the greenhouse gas emissions annually over the planet. This is the current emission profile as of 2 years ago. The green is the flatulence and the burps, the belches from livestock. Red is the emissions associated with soil erosion. When you break up soil, the organic matter decomposes and it blows off as carbon dioxide usually. Unless the soil is wet and heavy clay soil, then it'll blow off as nitrous oxide or methane, two other greenhouse gases. The blue is the emissions associated with producing fertilizers and using fertilizers and the cropping of land. And what you can see is the current emission profile. And then if we take what IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, suggests, they have suggested we reduce the number of ruminants, number of cattle and sheep and goats on the planet. And what you can see is that the only result is a very, very de minimis reduction in the emissions associated with livestock, because the cropping systems are still in place, the erosion system, the erosion cycle is still in place, fertilizers still being manufactured and used. As soon as we start converting, and this is all hypothetical, we said, what if 25% of that 5 billion hectares of rangeland and cropland could convert to amp grazing and low disturbance cropping? What we learned immediately was there's really significant changes that occur. Anything below the line is positive. If it's less of the emissions if it's below the line. And if it were even possible to get 50% of the farmers and ranchers to consider changing, or gosh, wouldn't it be amazing, but absolutely unlikely, to get 100%, these would be absolutely significant changes. And the economies associated with this change are remarkable based on what the socioeconomists on our team are telling us. So we're working right now toward a 1 billion ton project. McDonald's and Cargill and a number of other corporations have stepped up and said, this is important enough that we need to understand how real this can be. Can this be scaled? Can it be scaled rapidly? And we're right now putting together a 1 gigaton, so 1 billion ton of reduced emissions and improvements in soil carbon is the project we're beginning to work on. The green dots you see here, including those down in your neighborhood, are all the innovative farmers and ranchers that we knew of at the time when this map was made, and now there's hundreds more. This is catching on in spite of the farm programs, in spite of what some of the land-grant universities are teaching. Farmers and ranchers talking across the fence line and going to events are really, really beginning to worry about business as usual, and they're beginning to make pretty significant changes. Where I come from, for sure, and in many other places in the country. So I wanted to change the subject for a minute and transition to Jim, who'll be up here in a minute. And I want to bring my composure back, because this is pretty serious personal experience. 2.5 weeks ago in Alaska, I was with these wonderful elder Eskimos. Those are 70 and 80-year-old Eskimos. I thought I was small. They were like up to my chin, and the most dynamic and vibrant people. And the little woman, Marty Awalin, her family and Willard's family have lived on the same land with their community for about 8,000 years. The same land for 8,000 years. There's grave sites out in the tundra that are their relatives. There's old house sites, stone foundations that are 2,000 years old, and they have the memory of place to know who lived there in general. So they said, "Oh, you must see the walrus haul out when you come up and visit." And I said, "What the hell's a walrus haul out?" And they said, "Well, this is where 45,000 walrus come out of the Arctic Ocean," which is what you're looking at, the image on the left. They used to go on the shelf ice. There used to be ice all summer, and they used to breed on the ice. But now, because the ice isn't there, they're coming onto the barrier island. And I tried taking a picture from a half a mile away with a 600 millimeter Nikon camera and lens, and that's what a 3,000 pound walrus looks like from a half a mile away. They're huge. I had no concept of how big they are, and I had no concept of what a haul out was. And when we got there, so that this is an image of us motoring a half a mile away. They didn't want to get any closer because they stampede, and the females and the juveniles will get killed. So half a mile away, I took the picture, and then we went way down the beach and got out of the boat, and I was in shock. There were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of dead walrus on the beach. And I said, what's happening? Why are they dead? And they said, we don't know. We have never, ever experienced anything like this. We see a few every year, here and there. And we collect the bones and the tusks, and we carve them. But we have not seen anything like this before. Stepped out of the boat and went over. I asked if I could go look at this walrus. The first walrus I've ever seen in my life was getting covered over by the beach gravel and sand. It was very emotional. I was just traumatized by it. I expected to see, living, vibrant, and get a little closer and seeing all the dead ones. You can see the red where grizzly bears have come and ripped them open and are eating them. Sorry, it's right before dinner. I apologize. This was a very traumatic experience, and I went back And I asked Willard and Marty again, what's happening? And they said, water's too warm. They breed and they need to cool off. They used to do that on ice. Now they can't. There's no ice. So they're dying. And not all of them are dying, but some large numbers seem to be dying. And then fast forward 2 days later, I went to a trout stream, a salmon river, and I was going to try to catch a beautiful trout called a Arctic char, which is just stunningly beautiful. And I looked down in the water. We flew over it in our bush plane, and we could see tens of thousands of salmon in the river, and decided to land on that gravel bar and get out and try to catch an Arctic char. And I went down to the water with my fly rod, and there were thousands of fish, big, beautiful females full of eggs and males that were, normally they would be engaged in breeding behavior and laying eggs and so forth. They were breathing as fast as they could open and close their mouth. The water, when I stepped in my sandals, these same sandals, was warm. And this is a river that's coming off the Wrangell-St. Elias glaciers, which is usually ice cold. And I asked the elders, why are the salmon not breeding? Why are they not spawning? Water too warm. And so I experienced personally a really, really, really traumatic series of introductions to what's happening in Alaska. It was 80 degrees out in the Arctic, which was remarkable. So I think with that, James, if you want to come up, it's my understanding that you work way south, and I happen to be way north.
Yeah, okay. I just want to